Jim, this first question is from Doug in Columbus, Georgia. Hello, Jim. Aloha, Brian. After listening to the Booking the Territory guys cover the Bluegrass Brawl from 1993, which to this day is one of the best booked shows ever, and watching Tracy Smothers win the Smoky Mountain Wrestling title with a great payoff to a great angle, I was wondering why his run with the title was so short. Compared to the Dirty White Boys, and there's periods where there shouldn't be periods here.
Okay.
Why was it so short compared to the Dirty White Boys, and was there a plan to put the belt back on him at some point?
Now, whose was shorter than White Boy?
Tracy Smothers.
Oh, Tracy. Well, first of all, and it's funny, bring me back to this subject if I forget, but it's funny he says the best book show, et cetera, but no, it just worked out that way that we did it that way. It wasn't really anything to say that Tracy wasn't a success as champion, but in what we were in with the personalities we were in and what people were buying, it seemed like they would rather see Tracy chase it and win it than hold it and defend it. You know, we wanted to keep heat on the heels and have Tracy fight from underneath and et cetera. So it just worked out that way. And also, as your promotion ages, sometimes unless you find a fucking superstar, your title reigns are going to get shorter because there was a need to establish it at the start. I couldn't get Brad Armstrong, and I don't mean that as a knock on Brian Lee, but I wanted to have a babyface champion at the start, but somehow, try to get him over. And then when it became obvious that probably being the top babyface was not Brian's fit, and he later on was great as the heel tag team champion, I decided to put as much heat on Dirty White Boy as possible and run him through a program with Tim Horner and have him retain the belt over different people so that Tracy could come along and win it, and that theoretically would get Tracy over. But then Tracy didn't need to – Tracy was popular. He didn't need to hold the thing. It almost was better if you fucked him out of it and people wouldn't see him get it back. But as far as best book show, if you asked me for one thing that I would do over, one finish that I would do over in any Smoky Mountain Wrestling show, but especially a big one, it would have been I fucked up and did the wrong finish in the main event at that night. The 3-team 9-man street fight, Robert Fuller, Jimmy Gold, and Dutch Mantell, the Stud Stable, versus the Rock and Roll Express and Arn Anderson versus Bobby Eaton, Stan Lane, and Tom Pritchard, the Midnight Express Heavenly Bodies combination. And we were going to have those guys that same match in Knoxville and Johnson City 2 weeks later. And I didn't want to beat the heels until those matches, because I thought if we get some heat in Pikeville, we got time to show the finish on TV and come back, and then everybody will get even in Knoxville and Johnson City, and we'll prolong the program. And what I should have done was put the Rock and Roll and Arn over for the pop in Pikeville, and then us jumped them and had Riggy Morton carry it out or something to get some heat, because it was a great match and the crowd was insane, and they had already seen Tracy win the title, so they already had a big babyface win, pop. But it was a downer to have Dr. Tom with the loaded boot, I believe, on Hoot, boom, 1, 2, 3. The people are like, we should have got the big blow and then got heat afterwards. So the one big booking mistake in my mind that I made, he thought was the best book show he had seen. So there you go. Some people like to have their balls nailed to a step stool.
Couple questions coming out of this. One, I was recently talking to Mike Mills from the Booking the Territory podcast, which was mentioned in his question about the Bluegrass Brawl, and he brought up a great question to me. When Robert Gibson climbed up the basketball net before he fell off it, where was he going?
He was chasing Bobby.
He went flying off that thing. That's one of the most brutal falls you'll ever
What
see.
happened was, he was Bobby Eaton to get away from Robert Gibson. It's a 3-team 9-man street fight. 3 teams of 3 people, in case you're not familiar. So I think it's the only time it's been done. The Stud Stable was theoretically heels, but they had a problem with the Bodies and I, as well as with the Rock and Roll and Arn Anderson, who was the surprise mystery partner to even things up. And anything was legal anywhere. And my God, it was a Tennessee wrestling spectacular. But at one point, Robert Gibson chases Bobby Eaton up a ladder up onto the basketball goal. and Robert is climbing the ladder, and he's going to get up there, and I believe Bobby was probably going to take a bump off the basketball goal. Probably, because, I mean, they were just doing this shit as it happened. At one point, they chased Bobby back to the locker room, and he came out with an entire full-size car tire around his arms, around his midsection. And they were just doing shit, and it was just crazy. But as Hoot's climbing the thing, he tries to take a swing at Bobby to punch him while he's still on the ladder, and the ladder just slipped and went straight out from under him, and he dropped straight to the fucking floor. And that he was convinced he had broken his ankle, and so he convinced me. So I went home that night thinking, okay, and now Robert Gibbs of the Rock and Roll Express has a broken fucking ankle, but it was badly sprained, and I maybe missed a match or two, but he was back for the big shows. But it just, so yeah, it was scary. And then when the fire extinguisher came out from under the ring, that was the big one. That was the big pop. That crowd was just so incredible that night. The Pikeville crowd was always our best crowd of the year. The next year we had the cage loser leave town match between the Rock and Roll and the Bodies, and they threw the babies in the air at the finish. That was one of my favorite finishes I've ever been involved in the business. So they were always good.
It's too bad you didn't license that footage 15 years ago to Kit Parker, who would be out having some DVDs of it right now.
Oh, well, no, unfortunately, that's not on it. God damn it. That match is not on any of the licensed DVDs, but you can find it out there on YouTube. It's been out there, but there are some fine Smoky Mountain matches available while they last at JimCornette.com due to that warehouse fine, but we won't go into that now.
And I don't think I've ever said this to you, but I know you always envisioned Brad Armstrong in that spot as the top babyface in Smoky Mountain, and if you would have had him at the beginning of 92, that would have been the guy you went with instead of Brian Lee in that spot. But I've always believed that Tracy was the guy. Like, Tracy fit that role better than Brad would have. They're different workers, and I think Tracy's one of the most underrated workers I've ever seen.
Yeah.
He's one of the best wrestlers I've ever seen a lot of live. Because I got to see him a lot live, not just in Smoky Mountain, but when he came up to work for Dennis Carluzzo. And he's one of the best I've ever seen live. And Brad Armstrong's great too. So I'm not trying to put down one or the other, but I've always believed that Tracy was the guy. He was the perfect fit for that spot, more than Brad would have been even in 92.
Well, you may be right. And as a matter of fact, and I think part of the thing also, we got Brad at the end, but it hurt that we didn't have the level of challengers for him at that point, and also they'd seen another 3 years of him being abused and more or less presented as less than a top attraction on WCW TV and etc. But I think the difference was Brad was like Ricky Steamboat compared to Tracy, who was not just that classically smooth worker.
Yeah,
but Tracy's personality, because he would flip, and a lot of his promos would be a shoot. He'd flip right there on the goddamn promo. I remember one time he got so worked up, he said, if anybody don't like it, and he gave his home address. I live at some Hillside Drive in Springfield, Tennessee, if you don't like it. And he gave his home address on the promo. Tracy just fired people up verbally more than Brad did. And I think, so, you may very well be right. And I was glad we got to have Brad the last year there, but Tracy had set a heck of a standard.
Our next question comes from Keon. I've been listening to this show and the experience since their inception. This is the first time I've actually bothered to ask a question for some unknown reason. Thank you for the Wrestling Gold DVD set.
Well, you're welcome, and I'm glad you finally decided to bother.
I'm trying to get the stench of sports entertainment out of my mouth, as I'm only a mere 20 years old and have grown up on nothing else. My question for Jim is,